Part of the problem when we think about language and disability is the way we think about equity and justice that is often implicit in those discussions. And as we think about this conundrum, the challenge we have is to borrow from Behar, how do we avoid dehumanizing those whom we were seeking to represent in our work, whether it's research or practice? How do we stop dehumanizing those groups, those individuals? Hopefully by acknowledging their social, historical, and cultural context. Mainly because we don't stop to think about, once we give the label, what are the consequences of the label? I'll go back to that as well in a minute. It's something that we need to be asking more regularly. When we assign categories, we have to remember that people will occupy the locations in society that those labels give them. That might bring benefits and resources, or it might bring stigma or closed opportunities. And for that reason, it's critical that we follow the consequences of our decisions. One of the things I've been pushing hard over time is the way we report findings in the research community, in part because there are demands of research methods that prevent us from doing things that make a big difference in people's lives. In the end, researchers owe it to communities that we're producing knowledge to make their lives better. And for that reason, we should care about the moral implications of the work we do in communities with teachers and parents and kids. So how do we reconcile these complex realities of people's lives with the demands of certain research methods that compel us to ignore those circumstances, that pushes us to be sanitizing our findings and avoid telling the ugly stories that we might have seen, and just report findings as if, following the anthropologist Renato Rosaldo, we're projecting a view from nowhere, as if the findings are just there. They come from nowhere. There is no perspective. We have no individual investment in it. So it's an important reminder for the moral dimension of the work we do as professionals in schools as well as researchers. So what I would like to do is challenge us today to consider disability and second language as more than broken kids and families, or more than biased school staff. We tend to see that dichotomy. Are we placing too many of these kids because school staff is biased, or because these kids are broken? I want to challenge ourselves to go beyond that simplistic representation. And I will urge all of us to consider a more complex explanation of this long-standing equity problem, in which we take account of history, systems of oppression, ideologies, and cultural practices. And so I will make the case to reframe how we examine and address the intersections of disability with second language. And I will cover 4 things. Before I do that, let me just tell you briefly some of the problems we find in the literature looking at this. One is we know enough, we have plenty of evidence that context makes a big difference in how we frame and serve dual language learners with disabilities. And you will see when I mention the findings. Second, we have a team of researchers for the last 10 years have been pushing this narrative that tends to simplify the problem. They ask, are these kids overplaced or underplaced? Which one is it? What is the problem? And they consistently find that these students tend to be under-identified. And they say, see, what we need to do is to place more of these kids. And all of the regulations and policies in the country to monitor racial and linguistic disproportionality are misleading. We should change that and just avoid placing kids, not placing kids, and place more of them. Or is it because it's bias and they consistently find no bias anywhere in the country, no matter the region where they do it? Now, there are some interesting counter stories to these findings. For example, Latinx communities or students are not disproportionately represented in disability categories. That group says poverty explains most of it because a lot of students of color, including immigrants and English learners, are poor, or a sizable number of them are. That's why they have deficits, and that's why they need to be in special ed. When you look at the data of Latinx communities, these kids are not disproportionately placed in special ed. How do you explain that if poverty was your choice of explanation? We also found in a study, my colleagues and I, a number of years ago, that the level of the school poverty was inversely or negatively associated with the risk to be identified. And this was a study we did in California. In other words, the higher the poverty level of the school, the lower the risk to be placed in special ed for these kids, for English learners. And you think, what's happening in those places? If you have wealthy schools placing more of these kids, which is what we found, they have more resources, they have better prepared teachers, they have all of these things at their disposal. How is it that we see these issues? What is institutionally? I cannot tell you why, but it raises questions about the context that matters. We see states gaming the federal policy of disproportionality monitoring. We have found the level of disproportionality that is required to trigger significant changes in their practices. You know, you have to report every year how many, and if you get to the threshold that marks disproportionality, and you do that over 3 years in a row, you get cited. States are moving up that threshold because that's something states run. They decide what counts. So in some states, might be 3 times. In San Francisco Unified, it's 3 times. That's likely to count as disproportionality. But states might say it has to be 5 times. Other states might be 2. And as you see pressure mounting, then you see that threshold moved up. So there is a lot of that going on, and you have to wonder, what is that about? What is that indexing when we see these moves, unfortunately? So we need to transcend these binary questions and really begin to examine things in more complex ways. And I will cover those 4 things: the historical legacies that we need to acknowledge. We cannot pretend these things never existed. Second, we need to look at the role of institutional factors. Third, we have to think about how ideology is underlying a lot of decisions, categories, actions we see taking place. And fourth, what if we take into account the perspectives of families and students to understand better the problem? What are we learning from them, from the little evidence we have on this issue?